The galaxy was vast, its stars countless, its species diverse. For eons, humanity had existed quietly among the cosmic expanse, a species more focused on survival than galactic conquest. To most of the advanced civilizations that spanned across the stars, humans were just another primitive species, no different from the countless others they'd encountered before. But what they didn't know, what they could never have imagined, was that humanity was more than what appeared on the surface. And all of that would change when they encountered our captain. In the quiet corners of the galaxy, the HFY Empire, one of the oldest and most formidable species in the known universe, considered itself the pinnacle of intelligence and military prowess. Their empire spanned hundreds of star systems, and they had never met a race they couldn't conquer. Their soldiers were like the perfect storm, unbeatable in combat, ruthless in strategy, and efficient in their terrifyingly swift expansion. To them, it was simple. They were the dominant force, and any species they encountered was just a stepping stone, waiting to be subjugated. The crew of the HFY warship had heard the rumors. A new species had emerged from a small planet in the Sol system, Earth, they called it. The humans had sent out a single, humble vessel to explore the stars, a primitive probe that couldn't even shield itself from cosmic radiation. It was nothing to worry about. It was just another futile attempt from a species that was still learning how to navigate their own world, let alone conquer the cosmos. The HFY had seen it all before. Another species to be measured, classified, and discarded. Or so they thought. But then, something changed. The first encounter was almost comical. The HFY observed a small, unarmed human ship entering their territory, its weak signal an easy target for their superior technology. They'd expected a quick and simple interaction first. The humans would beg for their lives. Then they would be crushed under the HFY heel, their world harvested for its resources. But instead of a plea for mercy or a desperate attempt to flee, the humans did something unexpected. The ship, small and fragile as it seemed, took a bold, unwavering stance, locking onto the HFY vessel with a signal so strong it disrupted their communications. The audacity to challenge the great HFY Empire in such a way was unfathomable. But it wasn't the humans who were causing the disruption. It was their captain, a human whose name was unknown to the HFY at the time, but whose presence would echo across the stars for ages to come. No one had ever seen anything like him, or at least not in a long time. His calm, determined voice crackled through the comms, sending a message so simple, yet so profound, that it shook the HFY to their very core. We're here to negotiate. Prepare yourselves to listen. The HFY scoffed at the transmission, assuming it to be a joke. How could this insignificant creature possibly think they had the power to negotiate? But as their sensors scanned the human ship, something unexpected happened. The ship, which they had believed to be defenseless, suddenly powered up its engines and shields to a level the HFY had never seen before in such a small craft. It wasn't just the technology, it was the human captain's mind that had them rattled. His brilliance was not in the technology he commanded, but in his sheer resolve. The first attack was a faint one that the HFY would have easily brushed off if they had only known what was coming. But in the blink of an eye, the human captain turned the tables, using their own weaponry against them. The HFY vessel, caught by surprise, took damage in places they thought impenetrable. For the first time in centuries, the HFY were forced to retreat. It was a victory, but not for them. The crew of the HFY ship were left in stunned silence. How could this have happened? How could this primitive species have turned their overwhelming might against them so effectively? It was unlike anything they had ever encountered. A species they had dismissed as insignificant had just proven they were capable of not just survival, but of striking back in ways the HFY had never imagined. The human captain didn't stop there. Word of this encounter spread quickly through the ranks of the HFY Empire, stirring up confusion, curiosity, and fear. How had one human, with his ragtag crew and unremarkable ship, become the greatest threat they had ever faced? Was it a fluke, or was humanity something else entirely? They were soon to find out. As the HFY gathered their forces, Preparing for a final, decisive assault on humanity, the human captain was already making plans. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any command ever could. His crew, a mix of humans and species from across the galaxy, followed him without hesitation. They didn't understand all of his tactics, but they trusted him with their lives. They had seen him turn impossible situations into victories. His mind was sharp, his strategy unorthodox, and his resolve unwavering. The time was drawing near for a confrontation that would change the galaxy forever. The HFY had underestimated humanity. They had thought us just another species to conquer, to wipe off the map, but they had made one fatal mistake. Humanity was not just another species. And the captain at the helm of that small ship wasn't just a leader, he was the embodiment of the human spirit. The galaxy would soon learn that when humanity fights, it does so with the heart of a lion and the courage of 1,000 warriors. But what happened next? Was humanity truly ready to face the full might of the HFY Empire, or would the captain's gamble cost them everything? The answers lay in the next encounter, a confrontation that would define the future of not just one species, but the entire galaxy. And as the human captain stared out into the vastness of space, he couldn't help but smile. The game had only just begun. The bridge of the human ship was silent, save for the steady hum of the engines and the occasional flicker of the command console. The crew was tense, each person lost in their own thoughts, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. They had already faced the unimaginable, surviving an ambush by the HFY and living to tell the tale. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. The HFY were coming for them, and this time, they wouldn't hold back. The captain stood at the center of the command deck, his eyes fixed on the star map projected before him. His mind was sharp, his every move calculated. But behind that calm exterior, there was a storm brewing. He had led his crew into the heart of enemy territory once before, but now, with the full might of the HFY Empire bearing down on them, the questions gnawed at him. Was it worth it? Could they really win this time? And if they couldn't, what would happen to the rest of humanity? The crew was waiting for him to make a decision, but it wasn't just about tactics or strategy, it was about survival. They needed a miracle, something the captain was known for pulling out of thin air, but even he wasn't sure he could do it this time. He'd led them through battles, but this was different. The HFY were coming in full force, and this time, the ship's weapons might not be enough to hold them back. Beside him stood the first officer, a woman whose steely gaze had never wavered. She had joined the crew with a single purpose, to protect the captain. Her loyalty was absolute, but the shadow of doubt lingered. She had seen the captain make miracles happen, but this time, she wasn't so sure. He was only human, after all, and there was a limit to how far even he could stretch. She didn't want to think about what might happen if he pushed himself too hard, if the cost of victory was too great. But it was a thought she couldn't escape. Every time she looked at him, she saw the toll the war had taken on him. His shoulders weighed heavy, his eyes clouded by the burden of command. He was a leader, a symbol of humanity's resilience, but he was also just a man. The science officer, a quiet but brilliant mind, scanned the data pouring in from their sensors. The HFY fleet was on the move, and the odds were against them. She had been one of the first to understand the power of the human spirit, the way their determination could turn the tide of any battle. But as she looked at the captain, she wondered if that spirit would be enough. Their ship was outgunned, outclassed, and outnumbered. Their only advantage was the captain's unrelenting will and their sheer unpredictability, but even that had its limits. Every flicker of emotion she saw in him, every flash of doubt or worry spoke volumes. They were all starting to question if they could really pull it off this time. And yet, none of them dared to speak it out loud. On the lower decks, the crew prepared for the fight of their lives. The engineers were scrambling to make final adjustments to the ship's systems, knowing full well that the battle ahead could easily push their fragile technology to its breaking point. They had already seen what the HFY could do, how their weapons cut through shields like paper, how their ships tore through space with terrifying precision. Every man and woman down there had seen the damage, had watched comrades fall, and now they were facing it all again. Their hearts beat faster with every passing moment, but they had no choice but to keep working, to keep preparing. There was no turning back. In the hangar bay, the fighter pilots were gearing up for what would likely be their final sortie. The lead pilot, a man who had fought in countless skirmishes, took a deep breath as he checked the systems of his fighter. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the task ahead. He had lost friends in this war, close friends, people he had fought beside for years. They had trusted him with their lives, and now it was his turn to protect them. But the X-Thoric were no ordinary enemy. Their technology was so advanced that a single hit could spell the end. The thought gnawed at him, the thought of losing another person, of losing the captain, of losing everything. Back on the bridge, the captain finally spoke, his voice steady, but heavy with unspoken fears. "Prepare for the worst," he said, his eyes scanning the crew. "We fight for humanity. We fight because we have no choice. We fight because if we don't, this galaxy will fall to the X-Thoric, and our children will never know what freedom truly means." His words were meant to rally them, to inspire them, but the tension in the room was palpable. They all knew the stakes. They all knew the risks. But they had been here before, facing the unknown, stepping into the dark. Yet this time, there was something different in the air. A sense of finality. The captain felt it too. He had always believed that humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to adapt, to overcome, to rise when all hope seemed lost. But even he couldn't deny the weight of the moment. The X-Thoric were relentless, and their grip on the galaxy was tightening. There was no guarantee they would survive this battle. They might win, they might survive, but what would be left of them? Would it be enough? The sound of an alarm broke the silence, a sharp, blaring reminder that time was running out. The X-Thoric fleet was here. The captain's eyes narrowed. There was no more time for doubt, no more time for second-guessing. This was it, the moment of truth. He turned to his crew, his voice low but filled with that same unyielding resolve that had carried them this far. "It's time. Let's show them what humanity is made of." And with that, they leapt into the unknown, the fate of their species and the galaxy hanging in the balance. But as the ship engaged its faster-than-light drive, the captain couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something bigger, something far more dangerous, was waiting for them out there in the dark reaches of space. The X-Thoric were only the beginning. What lay ahead could change everything, and even the captain's unmatched will might not be enough to hold it back. The jump to faster-than-light travel was a violent blur of motion, the stars streaking into lines of light as the ship tore through the void. But the moment the ship returned to real space, a hush fell over the bridge. The X-Thoric fleet was right there, looming like a wall of destruction. Their massive warships filled the viewports, dark shapes floating in the blackness of space. And right in the middle of them, an enormous flagship that could swallow their ship whole in an instant. The captain stood frozen for a heartbeat, calculating, analyzing. His mind raced through every strategy, every possible outcome. But he couldn't afford to waste time on indecision. "Not now. Deploy all fighters," he ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Shields up. We move fast. We hit hard. They won't know what hit them." His crew scrambled into action, but something was off. The first officer, usually at his side in these moments, hesitated before giving her orders. Her eyes flicked to the science officer, who, despite his usual calm, looked rattled. She wasn't the only one who noticed. The captain had felt it too, the shift in the air, a fracture forming between them. The crew had always trusted him, but now, with the X-Thoric so close, they were starting to doubt. And it wasn't just about the battle. In the command center, the engineer who had always been loyal to the captain, who had saved their lives more times than he could count, approached him quietly. "Captain, there's something wrong with the FTL drive. It's unstable. I don't think we can jump again if we need to." The captain's jaw tightened. "How long until we have to make that decision?" "Minutes," the engineer said. "Maybe less. If we don't finish the fight by then, we'll be sitting ducks." He swallowed, his voice barely audible. "And there's something else. I've been running diagnostics. The last jump we made, it wasn't clean. Something Something's been tampered with. The captain's pulse quickened, but he held his composure. Tampered with? What are you saying? The engineer hesitated, glancing around nervously. I think someone sabotaged it, Captain. There's a breach in the system, and it's not an accident. The words hit like a bullet. The captain's mind immediately went to the first officer. She had been at his side for years, loyal, trustworthy. But the doubt had already crept in. Had she turned? Or was it someone else on the crew? The thought gnawed at him like an open wound. He couldn't focus on it now, not with the ex-Thoric closing in. But it would be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to tear them apart when they least expected it. He glanced toward the first officer, trying to gauge her reaction, but before he could speak, the comm system crackled to life with an unexpected transmission. A strange signal distorted, flickering through the void. It was so faint, so broken, that for a moment the crew wasn't sure if it was even real. The science officer was the first to respond, her voice filled with uncertainty. Captain, there's something coming through the static. It's not human. It's too complex, too structured to be random. She paused, eyes wide. It's a code. A shiver ran down the captain's spine. A code? It was almost impossible to decrypt something in real time, especially with the ex-Thoric breathing down their neck. But this wasn't just a distress signal or a random transmission. There was something deliberate about it. Something important. Can you isolate it? The captain demanded, stepping forward. The science officer tapped furiously at her console, her brow furrowed in concentration. It's a loop, like a message buried within layers of static. It's not just a signal, it's a warning. She hesitated. A warning about the ex-Thoric. The words hung in the air like a thick fog. The captain's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the key to understanding the ex-Thoric's true intentions? Could it be a way to turn the tide in their favor? Or was it something darker, something more dangerous? The first officer stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. We don't have time for distractions. The ex-Thoric are right on top of us. We need to focus on the fight. Now. But the captain wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the science officer's screen, watching as the signal slowly unraveled itself, like a puzzle falling apart in real time. Suddenly, the message became clear. This is a warning from an unknown source, the science officer read aloud, her voice trembling. The ex-Thoric are not alone. There is a force moving behind them, a force far greater than anything they've ever faced. And it is coming. The words hit like a hammer, the room falling into a stunned silence. The crew was already on edge, but now, everything they had known about the war, about their place in the galaxy, had been thrown into question. The ex-Thoric were just the beginning. A greater force was coming? What did that mean for humanity? The captain swallowed hard, his mind racing. Could this be true? Was it a trap? A lie? His gut told him it was real. Something bigger was out there, something they couldn't see yet, but something that had been pulling the strings all along. His eyes turned back to the first officer, her jaw clenched tight. She knew it too, but neither of them spoke. There was a secret between them, one that neither of them dared to acknowledge, not yet. But the fracture was there. Between the sabotage, the secret message, and the impending battle, something was breaking. And they were running out of time to figure out which pieces would hold together and which would shatter. A voice suddenly echoed through the comms, cutting through the tension. Captain, the ex-Thoric are charging their weapons. They're preparing for a full assault. It was the lead pilot, his voice shaking with urgency. We're ready to engage, but we need your orders. The captain stood at the center of the bridge, torn between the message, the betrayal, and the war they were about to fight. He took one last look at his crew, at the people who trusted him with their lives, and knew he couldn't protect them all. Not this time. Not with everything falling apart. All hands brace for impact, he ordered, his voice cold and resolute. We fight now. And after, we figure out who's pulling the strings. And as the battle began, the crew knew that the true war was just beginning, and it wasn't just against the ex-Thoric anymore. The ship lurched as the ex-Thoric fired their first volley, an onslaught of energy blasts that rattled the hull and shook the crew to their core. The bridge lights flickered, casting eerie shadows as alarms blare across the deck. The captain's hand slammed onto the command console, his knuckles white as he gripped it tight, watching the damage reports flood in. "Shields at 40%, the first officer called out, her voice tense but steady. "We're taking hits to the aft." The captain clenched his jaw, eyes darting between the view screen and the crew. They were in the thick of it now, and there was no turning back. His mind raced through their options. He had to act quickly, but everything felt like a blur. The sabotage to their FTL drive, the cryptic message, the looming threat of something worse than the X-Thoric, there was too much. Too much to process in the moment. Too much to fix. "Return fire," he barked. "Full power to forward weapons. Divert all remaining energy to shields." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something in the air, a nervous edge that none of them could shake. They were fighting for their lives, but it felt like something more, a desperate race to outrun something bigger, something they hadn't even begun to understand. The ship shuddered again, another barrage from the X-Thoric. This time, the impact sent them spiraling. Warning lights flashed red, and the whole ship groaned as the energy shield flickered dangerously close to failure. "Report," the captain demanded, but before anyone could respond, the comms crackled again, louder this time, sharper. Another signal. Another transmission, cutting through the chaos like a knife through butter. "Captain," the science officer shouted, her hands flying over her console. "The signal is coming from inside the X-Thoric flagship. We've been locked onto." "What are you talking about?" the captain snapped. "We're under attack. Focus on—" But the science officer's voice trembled as she stared at the screen. "It's not just a signal, Captain. It's a direct communication. It's speaking to us." The first officer's gaze hardened. "Impossible. They're attacking us." "No," the science officer insisted. "This isn't from the X-Thoric. It's not their language. It's not even their technology." The captain's stomach twisted. He turned to the first officer, her expression mirroring the same confusion and fear that churned within him. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "I mean—" The science officer's voice wavered as she continued, "This message, it's from the same force behind the X-Thoric. But it's different. It's almost familiar." The captain's heart skipped a beat. Familiar? Before he could demand more answers, the comms came to life with a voice low, mechanical, and strangely human. "We know who you are." The words sent a shiver down his spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. The voice continued, each syllable calculated, precise. "We have watched you. We have followed your every step. You are not the first to rise up against us, and you will not be the last." The captain's blood ran cold. He gripped the console harder, his thoughts spiraling. This force had been watching them? Following them? "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice edged with a cold fury. "What do you want with humanity?" The voice on the comms paused for a moment, as if considering the question. Then it spoke again, this time with an ominous finality. "We are not your enemies, human. But we are not your allies either. We are what remains." The line cut abruptly. Silence fell over the bridge. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the message hanging over them like a dark cloud. The battle raged on, but now the question wasn't just about survival. It was about the very fabric of their existence. What did that message mean? The captain felt the ship lurch again, this time more violently. The viewports showed the X-Thoric flagship powering up a massive weapon. They were preparing to unleash everything they had. "Brace for impact," the first officer shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of the creaking ship. The captain's mind raced, but one thought burned through the chaos. This is it. This is the end. The ship shuddered as the X-Thoric fired. The impact was catastrophic, the force of the blast sending them tumbling into darkness. Red lights flashed, alarms blared, and the ship groaned under the pressure of the attack. The captain barely had time to react before everything went black. In the stillness that followed, the captain awoke to a world turned upside down. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sat up, disoriented. The bridge was in ruins, panels sparking, consoles cracked, and the smell of burnt wiring heavy in the air. He struggled to his feet, his body aching from the blast. "Captain!" a voice rasped from behind him. He turned. It was the first officer, battered but alive. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and disbelief. Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling. The captain looked out the viewport. The stars were no longer the same. The ex-Thoric fleet was gone, vanished into the abyss. But something else was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. A massive structure, dark and imposing, loomed in the distance. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a shape that seemed to defy logic, bending space around it like a distortion in the fabric of reality itself. The science officer stumbled forward, her voice barely a whisper. It's not a ship. It's something else. Something ancient." The captain's stomach churned as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't the end of the war. It was the beginning of something far worse. "What do we do now?" the first officer asked, her voice shaking. The captain didn't answer. He just stared at the alien structure ahead, his mind reeling with the weight of everything they had just uncovered. One question burned in his mind. What had the ex-Thoric really been trying to warn them about? And as the darkness of space stretched out before them, two more questions echoed in his head. Who else was watching them? And why were they here? The answer was just beyond reach. But they were about to find out.